Achieving optimal health and self-realization in the modern world involves more than just diets of our food and exercise. It requires a new relationship with light, externally and internally. Welcome to the Light Diet. Hey everybody. On this episode of the Light Diet Podcast, I interview my good friend, Kyle Kingsbury. I've known Kyle for just over a year or so. I went to Onnit about September of 2019 to do a podcast about sunlight. And Kyle and I acquainted, and we've met each other a handful of times between then and now, just all over the world. One place was in Tulum when he was down there doing a Fit for Service mastermind with Aubrey Marcus, and he invited me to come and listen to his talk and hang out and meet some of the group. And anyway, Kyle has been a former professional fighter. He's also worked as the director of human optimization at Onnit with Aubrey Marcus for several years, from which he recently stepped into a different position where he's now focusing on his podcast, no longer at Onnit. And before that, he worked at all sorts of really interesting and different careers and jobs throughout his life, which you'll hear about here on the show. But Kyle is someone who I just feel so comfortable around because he's such a nice person. He is a giant. He is 6'3". He is 250 pounds probably plus, and yet he is one of the most gentle and peaceful and kind beings who I have ever met in my entire life. So, he's been someone who I look up to along the likes of Aubrey Marcus and Paul Chek and Ben Greenfield and other modern people who I would consider Renaissance men of the modern day. These are people who are taking on the responsibilities of being a man. And these are going to be people who are really elders. Like, for example, like Paul Chek really is an elder already in many ways, like who are wise people who are looked up to and esteemed because they're doing the work. They're doing the research. They're learning about life. They're being great men in their family and great people to the world and contributing something and cultivating their gifts and their talents and not shrinking away from the responsibility or the burden of life, but rather opening up and expanding into the opportunity of life. And so I just feel inspired whenever I spend time around someone like Kyle or these other folks I mentioned. And so I decided I wanted to interview Kyle for the Light Diet Podcast to hear his take on whatever it is that we wanted to talk about, which in this case, it ended up being a conversation all about, well, partially about what's happening in the world today with sort of technocracy takeover and sort of the globalism that is really rampant in our world, especially with COVID things going on now. And people who aren't familiar with these things could really get an idea from Kyle speaking about what the real risks are to each of us of the type of world that we're starting to live in and how, the things that we think could never happen again, like Nazi Germany and this level of control and Soviet Russia and communist China and so on, they're actually happening in the United States in many ways. But we also talk a lot about, from Kyle's perspective, what is the best that we can each do to fulfill our part, so to speak, in our lives and to be the best humans that we can be, not just for others, but also for ourselves. Kyle shares more book, video, audio series, and so on recommendations than anyone I've ever heard on any podcast. So I think this is going to be extremely valuable for anyone listening to walk away with a massive amount of knowledge and things we could potentially be doing to optimize our health and our life and our relationship with ourselves and our energy and our purpose and our connection. So I hope you enjoyed this podcast with Kyle and check out his podcast, the Kyle Kingsbury Podcast. Anyway, thanks so much for tuning in. If you're listening to this podcast, just know I love you very much, and I'm so glad you're a part of the Light Diet audience and you're here to learn about light, how it affects our body. And this particular show is really cultivating our inner light, step 8 of the Light Diet. It's really focused on how can we be better people. Anyway, enjoy and have a fantastic day.
We're recording, right?
Yeah.
This is the juicy shit I'll talk about throughout it. But
Great.
How many people out there say, "Oh, I have nothing to hide. I don't do anything illegal." And while that's true, they're just willingly giving away their fucking freedoms. Like, it's one thing to say, I'm not going to go to jail for anything that I say. While that may be true, it's another thing to just acquiesce to freedom of speech being fucking deleted everywhere right now. Right?
Yeah.
It's like, And, or they'll make the argument like, but we shouldn't say certain things. And it's like, yeah, we should not. And we should have the choice in that. We should have the ability to say, this is how we should live, or this is the way I want to live. This is how I want to teach my kids to live. But that's not fucking policed, right?
Yeah.
Like, I don't want to get a printout for dropping an F-bomb like in Demolition Man with Stallone and Wesley Snipes. Like, no, there shouldn't be a ticket for that. There shouldn't be a ticket for crossing the line verbally because it assaults no one, right? Even though technically if I say certain language in a way that threatens somebody, that is assault, and there's hate speech and all that other shit, like that's fine. But at the same point, when you take it to what can and can't be done online, we no longer have a free internet. And we clearly do not right now.
Yeah. I mean, starting with Alex Jones, I mean, probably started well before that, but getting cut from every platform. And then you have, more people getting censored, like all the health people who used to run a good business.
Everyone from PaleoFX, I'm like, I heard Rob Wolf talking about this being shadow banned from Google and Facebook and Instagram. And I was like, he's not talking about vaccines. He's not Joe Mercola. He's not any of these people. Why are they going after him? And it's just alternative health, right? And so it really, the issue is kind of, and there's a shit ton I want to give people. Number one, if you're unfamiliar with any of this, you've seen The Creepy Line?
I haven't.
On Amazon? Must watch.
The Creepy Line.
Joe Mercola was talking to Paul Check about this on Living 4D. Just watch The Creepy Line. It's on Amazon Prime.
You have so many good
Okay. Yeah, Creepy Line. It's on Prime Video. It's must watch. It's all on Google. And this is all stuff they've proven. Like they those Google Earth cars that would go around with the ridiculous cameras on top. Yeah. They found out that they weren't just mapping the Earth. Anyone who had an open Wi-Fi server, they would take all the information off of and store it from people's homes and businesses. And what happened when this got proven in court? They just paid a fine. So slap on the wrist. Right? There's all sorts of shit. I mean, that's just like the tip of the iceberg. So definitely watch that. But it really talks about how information is curated. It's no longer a search engine. It's a this is what I want you to see engine and how that influences people. I get his name wrong. Dr. something Epstein. I don't want to say Jeff Epstein. Maybe it is Jeffrey. But it's Dr. something Epstein is a brilliant guy who Mercola interviewed on his podcast, who's featured throughout the documentary, but it's must-see. And then past that, there was somewhere else I wanted to go with this. We were talking about
Rob Wolf being an alternative health, and they're curating this is what we want you to see engine.
Yeah, I mean they can literally take everything away from you, and they can even delete website access. Now we've seen in the last week Parler getting taken down off the App Store on Apple and off of Google's App Store, and then Amazon flat out getting rid of their website. Because they own the servers, right? They own the ability to delete a website entirely. So,
I want to go deeper on this.
People don't think we're in a police state. It's like we have to understand. Like there are things happening now that may not impact you directly right now, but they impact all of us, and they impact our ability to understand what is real, what isn't, what is alternative. I mean, you've been on the front lines of alternative health from day one. That's what helped bridge this gap for me, because for a lot of people to understand what's happening in the deep state or a corporatocracy, technocracy, things like that, terms that I only used to hear a David Icke or an Alex Jones say, and I was kind of like, all right, maybe. There are books that really get into this, right? Like The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman by John Perkins beautifully illustrates, and I know this from plant medicines and things like that, having been to third world countries and been in military installations in places where I was like, how is this possible? And they're like, well, technically we're not here right now, but we're allowed to be to protect this country from that country. And Perkins really details how the CIA and the military industrial complex will overthrow a government, and people from third world countries know this inside and out. The only people who don't know this are US citizens, because it's never been discussed. Why would it be discussed? So there's a lot of uncovering that happens in that book. And, what's the driver? Well, money, right? Big oil, mowing down the rainforest, shit like that. It's not that big of a pill to swallow when you understand the why behind it, and it's very clear. Another great book for people to check out is The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray, who's a gay conservative. He was on Rogan's podcast. If you don't want to bite the whole book, listen to that podcast he did with Rogan. It's fantastic. But the book really goes into such great detail, and maybe it's because he's gay or maybe not, but he's not like the furthest right dude on the planet. He's more centrist, which I think most of us are. And at the same time, he understands perfectly well what is happening right now when we try to inflate the idea of racism, when we inflate the idea of toxic masculinity, which is a fucking joke. I mean, in King, Warrior, Magician, I know I'm naming a lot of books, I'm sorry, folks, but King, Warrior, Magician, Lover by Robert Moore and another guy who are Jungian analysts talk about this in the very first chapter, in the opening pages of what the feminist movement did to men. But what they're doing, in a sense, is they're looking, look, I have a mom and a sister, I have a daughter and a wife. I am all for human rights and women's rights, and at the same time, anything that belittles or calls in guilt as a remedy is not the remedy, right? We are then just trading places. And what we've seen is a lot of women wearing the pants now. It's not to mean that any one of us should have the pants on in terms of who controls relationship or who controls the world. It's to say there is no better than if we're equal to one another. And what feminism has done is it's taken masculinity and only looking at the shadow, that archetype. And it's called that as the whole. Right? Shadow masculinity is a fucking problem. The shadow warrior archetype, we see that. The shadow king, we've seen that in politics and all around the world. We've seen that for many generations. But call it what it is and understand what it is and understand that the light side of that, the divine side of the king, the divine warrior, is something that needs to be called upon. And if we're not understanding what these archetypes are, they will operate largely in the shadow function until we recognize them what they are and transmute that. That's alchemy. So when they dive into this and Douglas Murray doesn't get in a ton into the archetypes, but he just says, this is what we see in the world, and this is what's happening right now, and this is the absurdity of it all, and really paints such a beautiful picture of the way through. And the way through, a lot of the times, is a softening. It is forgiveness. It is understanding that there must be some common ground for us to reach where we can communicate without blame, without resentment, and without, becoming the very thing we're against, like Antifa. You are the fucking thing you're against. You are fascist right now, claiming to be anti-fascist, and that's the odd and almost insane thing that's happening.
It feels to me like feminism, as it's currently described, is less feminism as it is more like anti-masculinity or certain facets of masculinity.
And that just comes from not understanding what real masculinity is, and not honoring that. And, as they say, and if you want to understand these things, these archetypes, and truly to understand it, King, Warrior, Magician, Lover is in my top 5. Is however many books I list on this podcast, and I do have a habit of doing that, but
which I appreciate, and I think the listener will appreciate.
I hope so, but it's a lot. I mean, the King, Warrior, Magician, Lover beautifully breaks down not only what the shadow versions of these are, the active and passive polarities of the shadow, and the divine side of these different archetypes, but it shows you how people wind up becoming adults in the shadow boy. They're boys. They've never, and so if there's trauma as a boy, which fucking raise your hand if you're a dude listening to this, yes. If there's trauma as a boy and you're not held by community or tribe, raise your hand. If you're not held and you're not carried through a rite of passage that brings you in through a hard experience, plant medicine or not, into your manhood and adulthood, having not gone through those practices, we're fucking locked into the age we were when shit happened, when shit went south. So like Rogan says, we have 60-year-old men in 60-year-old meat suits with a 7-year-old operating the system. And that's a problem because it's not just a happy 7-year-old, it's a hurt 7-year-old, right? We see that all the fucking time. We can see it in our parents at different times, right? So it's important to understand this because only through the knowledge are we able to figure the doorway out, right? Truth sets you free. That's a big piece of this, right? And that takes uncovering and discovery, which takes more learning. And you got to want that for yourself. You don't just take my word for it, dive in.
I remember you and Paul on one of, I believe it was him on your podcast. He spoke about how there's so many bitter and hurt and frustrated old men in their 60s and so on. And it's because they never became the elder, the wise elder. They're just frustrated children, you might say. They're, living with age, but not wise. And that's
Part of the bitterness too is buying into what society told them. The I'll be happy when, hey, bust your ass, give us your life right now, and when you're a certain age, you'll be able to do whatever you want. And then they get there, they get into retirement, pension gets cut, their dollar's worth shit, and they don't get to do what they want. And at the same time, they realize the fallacy of living a lie their whole lives, having never done what they wanted or explored what they wanted or went where they wanted to do, done anything that they wanted to do or kept a peace for themselves each day. Like, look, I worked for fucking Uber and Lyft. I worked at Burger King. When I lived in my mom's garage while I was fighting the entire time in the UFC, I was a bouncer and bartender at a titty bar. I've worked some shit jobs just to make ends meet like everyone else. Imagine doing that your entire life, right? Like that's where these people get to. And so I differentiate, the difference between a tribe elder, someone who's lived on the land, who has experience and wisdom, who's honored with reverence by every kid. I might fuck off with my parents, but if the abuela comes around, all the shenanigans stop, like that level of reverence for an elder. It's because they've held that spark of life through them. They're not a grumpy old man or a grumpy old woman. They're somebody who still fosters life within themselves, and they've done it throughout their lives. So there is that knowing, like, hey, this person's got it, and they're old and wise, and they're worth listening to. And even though they can't whoop my ass, and I can probably outrun them, I would never. Right? Like that level of reverence. Or you have the grumpy old man where you're like, why am I going to listen to you? You're just pissed off all the time. You don't know anything. You worked a blah, blah, blah job your whole life. You haven't seen the world. I know more than you, old man. And there's that lack of respect that we have for the older generation here in America and a lot of other modern societies. Right? And maybe that's overdoing it, but it's or oversimplifying it. But to a degree, there is truth in that. And I think, what's the point in explaining this? The point in explaining this is to say that if I'm now in my 30s, 40s, and 50s, what do I want to become? Right? We're always becoming something. Even if you're in your 60s, 70s, and 80s, you're still becoming something if you don't lose the spark. Mm-hmm. Right? So don't let that fire go out of what you're learning. And I had this phenomenal walk. I do a hike. I've done a couple hikes with Jamie Wheel, who's one of my favorite people in the world. And author of Stealing Fire. He has a new book coming out in April. Just a brilliant dude and a psychonaut. I envision myself as he's kind of somewhere in between where I'm at and where Paul Chek's at. Not just age wise, but he has a wealth of knowledge and a psychonaut from the jump. Started earlier than I did and has been in it longer. I love that
term, psychonaut. I want to get into
a true explore. What's the word I'm looking for? He explores the outer realms for sure, and the inner realms.
Do you know the song Vienna by Billy Joel?
Yeah.
So I heard that not long ago, and it just caught my ear. And I love to play the guitar. And I was almost thinking of bringing mine to play a song. I don't know if you guys have a guitar around.
We do. It's not tuned yet. You could tune it up.
I could tune it up and play a jam. But he sings, that when the truth is told, that you can get what you want, or you can just get old. And apparently the song comes from when his dad left him and if he had siblings when he was 8 or so, and he hunted him down when he was 23, and his dad was living in Vienna, and he said he saw an old woman sweeping the street just out of generosity for no other reason than just to be lending a helping hand. And he asked his dad, like, what are they doing? And his dad apparently said something like, here people value age. There's in that Eastern culture, and I lived, like I mentioned, in Bosnia, which is similar and very close to Austria. It was part of the empire for a little while, but they have that reverence of age, and families live together and are perfect. Families are they revere the elders much more. And I think his dad actually said Vienna waits for you was the term, and that's why it's the line of the song. And it, first of all, it struck such a strong chord with me because, I'm 21 and I've been working on my business, and sort of buying into this idea that I'll do some thing and achieve some certain level of success with my business, and then I can start to live my life the way I want to more. And of course, that's not accurate at all.
It's a trap.
It's a trap. And thankfully, I was able to, at a ripe young age of 19, have the cash to do what I wanted to do and learn with experience that money is not anywhere near happiness. It's almost like happiness is this, for me, it's more associated with the vision of potential and really experiencing life and putting it to rest to make money to then be able to do that. In that process, that sort of vision and energy of living sort of, in my case, sort of kind of shrunk down a lot because I was constantly deferring it. Like I heard someone say happiness is a muscle to be worked, and if you don't work it, it basically can atrophy. It isn't something like compounding interest where it just grows if you save it now, you'll have more of it later. I thought that was really interesting, and so that song seems super relevant to what we're talking about.
Brother.
I want to step back just to the technocracy in the U.S. sort of being not a force for good around the world in many cases. When I was 16 or 15, I came across a podcast called School Sucks, and I think you would probably really appreciate it. Nothing you don't already know, it sounds like, but I was first learning about just this thing called the trivium, so grammar, logic, rhetoric, which was the foundation of how to think that was taught in Greece and Rome and so on, to teach the intellectuals and people who were able to get an education how to really think, and how today it's what to think, just like Google is, here's what you get, not this is some information you can make your own conclusions. And the podcast went significantly further. It went into all these sorts of things I had never heard about, such as the U.S. being this empire that does this around the world. And I came across just an essay from a speech from General Smedley Butler. Have you heard that name before? He was a 5-star major general, I believe, around World War I. And he basically says in this excerpt of this speech, he says, I've served in every commissioned rank from basically lieutenant to major general. And now, I didn't have a single thought of my own the entire time until I left the service. And basically, he says, I was nothing more than a hitman for capitalism and for big banks and for Wall Street. We went all around the world, but the cool part was seeing him list out the different places they went. He said, we basically molested 6 Central American republics for the benefit of the banks. We totally molested Cuba for the sugar interests and so on. We molested China for Standard Oil, and in many ways are sort of responsible for all the things that have gone wrong in these countries, them turning into totalitarian dictatorships. And just to see that from a U.S. major general, of course, that's not something that's published and shared, but it's to your point of, we're not talking about this, but we are like the Roman Empire in a sense where even though it's not as obvious that we're controlling the world, we in a sense are, and it's not to the advantage of those people. It might get us, cheaper gas prices and some of the luxuries we have as Americans.
More stuff,
but it's feeding, we're in this sort of illusion. I like that you're talking about it because you're much more an expert on the subject than I am. And then technocracy, I had heard about because a friend of mine several years ago, so he handed me this book called Technocracy Rising, and it just detailed how there's these very large, wealthy individuals and, top-level individuals, so to speak. Someone I was speaking with recently called them the parasite class rather than the elite class. This guy, Anthony D. Clementi, he's Biohacking Secrets podcast.
He's my boy.
Yeah, I just interviewed him, or he interviewed me actually 2 days ago for his podcast, and he has so much knowledge on these things too. And well, in the Technocracy book, they go through the different sort of, I want to say, treaties, or not really treaties, but more like agreements that were made by these supranational organizations. Like I believe one was in Rio de Janeiro, but there's these, for climate change, like the not the New Deal, but there's something 21. I forget what it's called, but there's all these things that have been implemented, these policies to attempt to circumvent sort of the rights of nations in favor of this globalist ideal. And it doesn't appear to be
No,
anyone's
what
benefit
it
here.
appears to be in the end, and this is what's in
Agenda 21.
from a corporatocracy standpoint, you can draw all the links and understand exactly what Smedley's talking about with John Perkins' book, The New Confessions of an Economic Hitman. You see how that goes down. There's not a ton on technocracy within that, but now you see like this, that it is the same thing. The technocracies are working in a way, and we've seen, news sites and companies continue to join together and mergers happen until now there's like 9 major companies that control all movies, all TV stations, all everything. And that's it. I mean, Disney bought Marvel. Like they literally own so much. And so one thing that was circling around, which most people didn't see, but maybe a few people on this podcast, was the fact that they all read the same script. So this happened in Plandemic Indoctrination, the second film, which might trigger some listeners. Highly recommend watching that on plandemicseries.com, especially if you don't want to see it, especially if you've only heard bad things, or John Oliver told you not to, or you read something on The Atlantic that said it was dangerous. Fuck all that noise. Watch it for yourself. One of the most important things that shows you is it shows you a script that goes out where every major media station, when we grew up, or when I grew up, certainly, Fox News was Republican, it was right wing. MSNBC was left, and CNN was somewhere in the middle. And now they're all saying word for word the same shit. They show hundreds of channels across the board reading the exact same fucking script, word for word, verbatim. And so when you see that is a huge issue. We are being force-fed the same narrative over and over and over again. A narrative that tells us we need to run from nature. We had Dr. Zach Bush on the podcast, and he's like, you can't outrun nature, nor do we need to. He was on Del Bigtree's Highwire podcast. It was one of my favorite YouTubes of the year before they took it down. And he said, I don't think this was created in a lab. If they did, they didn't do a great job of it. And that goes against what they talk about in Plandemic, but don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. There's a lot of great information in that, especially on media and what's happening right now. Zach was saying it's like, it's not an effective killer. 99.8% chance of surviving. 99.8% survival rate. And what else have we seen with the statistics around COVID? The flu is down at an all-time low. All other forms of mortality are down. Well, that's because of the way they're fucking counting that. Somebody was on, one of the doctors was on Rogan's, was like, you get hit by a bus and you test positive for COVID, you don't die from the bus impact, you die of COVID-19. That's how they're counting this shit. And the hospitals do that on purpose because they get twice as much money for it. They get something like 37,000. 15 if you die, but it's doubled. It's like almost 40 grand if you die of COVID.
Wow.
Or maybe it's COVID in a respirator. Whatever the case is, there is a financial interest in making that claim. And look, the CDC, the World Health Organization, all these people are in bed with Bill Gates. He's on, he has 3 fucking TED Talks. He's like basically Thanos. He has 3 TED Talks talking about the largest threat to humanity in the globe is overpopulation. He wants to control the population, and he's said it many times. And at the same time, he's mentioned vaccines in the same line as a means to do that. And he's gloated about that's the greatest investment he's ever made was the vaccine industry, with a 10-to-1 or 20-to-1 return on investment. He's invested over $1 billion into vaccines. I mean, that's a whole other rabbit hole people can get into. I'm sure you've discussed on this podcast, but there's a way to connect these dots if you look at it, and it's overwhelming. It's like, holy shit, there's so much of this stuff going on. And then what's really been significant for me, especially having a 6-month-old and a 5-year-old, is like, all right, what do we do in preparation for that? What do we do in knowing the truth? What do we do in defending our personal sovereignty? And that comes down to not just decentralizing the big centralized things, but re-centralizing locally. I was reminded of this time I went to Kentucky where I saw, for the first time, I think it was like 28 or something like that, they had dry counties. No alcohol in the whole county. I was like, this is the dumbest shit ever. It's just alcohol. And I loved alcohol then, and I'm like, why would that's fucking stupid. You can't buy alcohol in the whole county? It's like, well, some people who don't want to drink, they live in this county. And the people who do want to drink, they live in that county. Then when I was in California and they legalized marijuana, really for corporations, they did the same thing. And I was like, that actually is brilliant. right? That allows us to live in the same state, but if we agree on certain things, we can live by those standards. And then, there's other standards in a different county. It's not far away. It's not like, I got family members in a different county who are like, yeah, we don't want that here. We don't want it sold in stores. And that's like a brilliant way to make, and we've seen this a little bit in politics, but it's really coming back down to empowering states and empowering locally. And if we do that, then everyone can have their fucking cake and eat it too, right? It's when we start to say top-down system control globalism, which really is communism. Democratic socialism. I'm fucking voted for Bernie in the primaries of 2016 in California. Complete 180 right now. Like, democratic socialism is the underpinning of that. Have you seen the video from G. Edward Griffin?
I haven't.
He's brilliant. He's talking about this. It's a YouTube video called Worse Than War. It's black and white. And he's talking about how communism will come in. There's basically two brands of communism. There's the totalitarian, warlike machine that just fucking conquers a people and takes over. Total force and aggression. And the other type that's really, the backdoor, quiet, nonviolent type. And there's tons of people. There's a GHB defector who goes on and talks about this, Yuri something.
GHB is
or KGB rather,
KGB,
not GHB.
gotcha.
GHB is the date rape drug, which is also quite phenomenal. Especially when you're not raping anybody, it's just good for sleep and growth hormone secretion, and it makes you feel like you're drunk. GHB is awesome. KGB. So KGB defector talks about this. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy's podcast. It's called Iconic Podcast. He does a brilliant job featuring G. Edward Griffin from this old school video. And G. Edward Griffin now is 89 and still talking about this. But this was the plan all along, was to infiltrate every form of government within the U.S. and to get people to buy into a one world or new world order. And the reason why you can't say, I'm a Republican, I'm a Democrat, I'm a this, I'm a that, is because they're fucking both overrun from the inside out. And there doesn't mean there's not a few good players left in the game, but what it means is it's on both sides. And so we've seen Bush Sr., who was head of the CIA, also first on the job when JFK was assassinated. And he's talking about New World Order. We've seen Gore talk about New World Order. We've seen all these people, left and right, talk about New World Order. They're all speaking to the same thing here, which is globalism. And globalism, at the end of the day, is a giant open-air prison for all of people to be enslaved in. That's the goal. I don't think it's going down that way. I certainly don't hope it's going down that way, and we're going to do whatever we can to prevent that from happening. But that's really what this boils down to.
Yeah, Keith and Michelle Norris told me that they do believe that there is something happening to the likes of an ascension where things are going to move in the right direction for humanity, but we are at sort of a critical juncture in our species where, it could go either way. And super interesting.
You want to get weird if we haven't freaked people out yet. Have you heard of Dolores Cannon?
No.
Okay, she was a hypnotherapist for 40 plus years. She passed away in 2014, and she has probably 16 books, I want to say. But what she did was she first started off in hypnotherapy for smoking cessation, sex addiction, your run-of-the-mill bullshit. Like, yeah, I'll help you get rid of this and that. And then what started happening is she would take people deeper and deeper until she's only talking to the subconscious, unconscious, what she called the superconscious. And as she tap in to she started working with past life regression. You got to buy into reincarnation as a starter. And I've certainly have verified some of that within my plant medicine experiences, or the infinite nature of reality. That's a little bit easier to understand. But with these past life regressions, she wasn't just running into like, oh yeah, I lived in Egypt, or I was an Atlantean, or any of this shit. It was like, I was a fucking fifth dimensional being of light with a rainbow body. Or I lived on a planet that had 23 hours of sunlight and we didn't understand darkness. Like, where there was no polarity in this existence. Shit like this. And so she gets into tons of stuff, but what happens over the course of the next 30 years is there's overlay and consistencies between people across continents, not living the same life, but telling similar stories. of extraterrestrial beings or being one of them, interdimensional beings, being in in a different space and time, and explaining what's happening on Earth and what's coming on Earth. So she wrote this book. She has several called The Convoluted Universe, which is kind of like all over the place. She has some questions about Bigfoot and weird shit, and it's just like, why are we wasting our time on that? Why are we wasting our time on that? But her book, The 3 Waves of Volunteers in a New Earth, is brilliant. And the basic understanding is that the Earth is shifting. This falls in line with every major prophecy known to man. Mayan prophecy, the Hopi prophecy. And the Hopi prophecy talks, it's a painting that talks about those with it's a painting that has 2 lines on it. One is the line of the Earth, and it's within the sacred hoop, a big circle. There's 4 people with their heads connected to their body who usher in the 5th stage of human consciousness. Zach Bush talked about that. The Earth itself is shifting. Dr. Will Tegela, who I'm going to have on this podcast, he wrote Walking with Bears. The Earth is on its own medicine journey, its own vision quest right now, and is shifting into the 5th state of consciousness. The people above that line, which are the masses, represented by 7 people, have their heads disconnected. They go on a trajectory that leaves the hoop. Either they leave the Earth and die, or they fucking go to Mars on Elon Musk's jetpack. I don't know what they do, but they are no longer a part of it. And this also goes into Book of Revelations. This goes into tons of shit that's been talked about for many, many years and written about thousands of years ago. And it seems to be occurring now. The issue is that for every generation prior, it had seemed like it was occurring right now. But when you understand where we're at technologically, where we're at information-wise, we can access stuff instantly, right? Like you think about the technological advances that have been made in the last 50 years. I was around, with corded phones on a wall before cell phones, before the car phone. And then you had the Zach Morris brick, like
well,
in
it's
your
funny
hand.
in the song Vienna, he says take the phone off the hook and disappear for a while, and I was like, what does that mean? Oh, it's like turning your phone off because it can't ring if it's off the hook. I was like, I had to really think about that one for a minute.
But you would have to hear that
yeah,
in the background faintly. So like we see all this, and it feels and has felt in part because it is happening, but there's a felt experience of how time seems to be speeding up. It feels like shit's just actually happening like at such a rapid pace. And if you go down the rabbit hole on any one thing, like it's verifiable. It's almost like the social dilemma where you have this, it's like a self-serving bias. Like, oh, I believe this thing. Well, fucking now that's all I see on the internet. It's all I see, on social media. My dad's a Facebook page. It's all pro-Trump stuff. My mom's is all pro-Biden stuff. And I'm like, oh, that's because you clicked like on a few things. So now that's all you get. But life itself is mirroring that in a weird way, where more and more we start to be connected in our tribes. But back to this point on Dolores Cannon, the Earth, in her opinion, and not her opinion, but from all the people she's done these regressions with in hypnotherapy, itself is going to change into the 5th dimension. And it will be like an overlay with 3D Earth. 3D Earth will experience another cataclysm and a reset, as we have had 4 times before. Humanity's been around. We've had great volcanoes. We've had the great floods. You get into Graham Hancock work, like that's on every fucking continent. People understand the Great Flood happened. Noah's Ark story aside, the Great Flood happened. And what they talk about with the asteroid or comet impact in the Younger Dryas bringing us out of the last ice age is completely verifiable by science now. They see that through the micronized diamonds that are all over in these different impact zones that brought us out of the last ice age. These things have happened. The great floods that took away Atlantis, all this shit happened at different stages that changed the course of human history. Likely, coincidentally, around a time where we could have destroyed the whole thing. So you call that God intervening, or you call that aliens intervening, or you call that consciousness itself saying, hey, wait a minute, let's push the reset button. These things seem to happen when we're at a point of causing a total failure to occur. Like you children can play and you have sovereignty and free will up until a certain point where you're going to destroy the whole thing, and then we bring you back down a notch and let you reset and come back. That resonates very strongly with me. At the same time, consciousness does not want a full reset at this point. They've gone through it 4 times already. This guy, Joyous Hart, on my podcast talked about this. We went through each of the elements. So we had earth through earthquakes. We had fire through volcanic activity. We've had the water through the great floods. And we've had air through, you could say, volcanic or different things like that, completely engulfing the globe with volcanic ash. So changing the air, changing the atmosphere, changing the temperature. And now we're in the etheric, right? We're in this mind Armageddon. And Armageddon translates to the unveiling. It's not like hellfire and brimstone. It's the unveiling where we witness truth. And this is what I think we're on the precipice of. And this is what I think Keith and Michelle are alluding to, is like this great awakening is taking place. But it's not everyone because of personal sovereignty. No one burns in hell for not choosing to be of service to others or choosing to know the truth. Many people are like Joey Pantaleone in The Matrix, where they're like, why did I take the red pill? Ignorance is bliss. I want to eat this steak and not wonder if the algorithm got it right, right? He doesn't want to know. He wants to go back to the way it was. There's a fuck ton of people who are the majority who want to just go back to normal right now, who think that everything happening in the world is just it's scary times and we don't know what's going to happen next, but soon enough we'll get our vaccines and our quantum passport ticket and I'll be able to fly again and everything's going to be fine and we'll just go back to the new normal and everything's going to be great again. And I'm going to
like your voice
I'm going to get this
a lot.
Yeah, I'm going to get that raise at my job and I'll climb the corporate ladder and then I'll get to retire and then I'll be happy. And it's like, no. This is our time to review everything we've done wrong in our own lives, personally, self, and review everything that's going on globally that we can't stand and recognize that too is me. Tat Twamasi. I'm fucking that too. I'm that too. And if I can start to fix within and heal, then we can share that light and we can operate at a different frequency, right? And we can reimagine what we want to create now. Whether the 5D reality is true and the 3D reality is true and Dolores Cannon's work or any of these other people that all seem to have parallel versions of that, from all these ancient cultures that knew so much to the Bible itself, whether that's all bullshit and this isn't that timeline, that's fine. But we are at a point right now where enough things are cracking and dismantling. We understand finance is a fucking joke. It's a complete control system. Fiat currency is a joke. We're printing money. It's a debt system that's meant to enslave. Thrive is a great documentary that breaks this down. It gets into aliens and shit like that, which doesn't necessarily need to be there, but Thrive 1 is phenomenal at exposing what the global interest is, how banking works at the very top, all of that, from a very few. You might call it Illuminati or Bilderberg or any of these other, they explain the subgroups, how they operate, how the pyramid scheme actually works. And David Icke has a great point too, if it's in the power of such a few, how can they control top down like that? That doesn't make sense. And he said, really, what you need to do is imagine an assembly line where you think you're building a car. All you have is the glass that goes in the side for one window on a door. And you do that every day, you do it great. Then one day, you leave for lunch early and you're like, fuck, let me go to the end of the assembly line, see what this awesome car looks like. And you see you've built a tank. You're like, fuck, for 10 years, I thought I was told I was building cars. And we've been building killing machines. We've been building tanks. That's what's happening on all these systems down, from the medical mafia to fucking everything else when you trickle down. And it's not to say all doctors are evil or any of this shit. I work with some great doctors. We've had many on the podcast. You know some great doctors. They're great people in all walks of life, and people are good. That's the whole deal. Mickey Willis said this at the end of Pandemic 2. One of the fallacies is that human beings are a virus. They say that in The Matrix, right? We're not the virus. Humanity is good. And certainly the people I've come across. Is there evil in the world? Fuck yes, it's undeniable. It's undeniable. The further you look, the further you see, there is real shit going on that's a huge problem. Real suffering. And it's cognitive dissonance for me to stay focused on my goals and say, well, I just want to make sure that little Johnny gets into college. And then, there's people starving everywhere, all over the world still. So how do I grapple with that? Well, I have to start to expand past me orientation, ego orientation into all. We are one, which is the crux of every great spiritual teaching. There's one more book I'll recommend. It's brilliant.
Please keep them coming.
Total mind fuck is Dispelling Wetiko, Wetiko, by Paul Levy. It could have been written yesterday. That's how pertinent it is to what's happening globally, to the control systems that are in place, and to the evil that permits the world, and just to darkness in general. But it's this idea that that is a non-local entity that we can easily project as other and make into or objectify, like Satan or something like that was the object of evil. But it exists non-locally and pervades every form of consciousness. It's our duty to recognize that first within ourselves, and that awareness, consciousness, light of consciousness is what allows us to move through that and call it for what it is. Buddha talked about it as Mara. You know, it's across the board in the spiritual teachings. It's not just a biblical thing, but it's the alchemy of that allows us to truly be sovereign. But if all we do is point fingers and say, I hate Bill Gates, well, Tatwamasi, I'm that too. Where is that in me to want to control the masses? Where is that in me to want to get rich at the expense of others? You know, and there are light archetypes to this as well. I'll name another book that you don't have to get, but Quantum Spirituality by Amit Goswami, who's a PhD. He talked about, you know, there are people on the planet who are exploring some of these global archetypes that are really important. And there's a light side and a shadow side. And two, I think he named 6. Love is one of them. Obviously, we're all exploring that. It's most all of us are exploring that. But power is one, and abundance is another, wealth. The light side of power is that you use your power to empower others. The dark side of power is you use your power at the expense of others. And the light side of abundance is your wealth makes all those around you more wealthy. The dark side of wealth is you gain wealth at the expense of others, right? So you can see that there's nothing wrong with the energy of money in and of itself. It's how it is used. And there's nothing wrong with power. It's how that is used as well. So it's important to understand the paradox of all these things. And I think Dispelling Wetiko brilliantly illustrates that held within the darkness is, it's almost like when you look at the yin-yang symbol and you see the half black side still contains within it the little white dot. And within the half white side within it is the little black dot. So within the darkness, the sea of infinite darkness, there still is that, the medicine right within it is held right there. And it's the alchemy of that polarity that brings us into unity, where we reach our divinity and we can choose to create rather than contract and kill the whole thing.
Thank you. This is amazing. I actually filled a full page in this little notebook with information. And I'm, like I mentioned, I'm going to Costa Rica. I'm taking sort of a month off my work, my typical work, to go a bit deeper. And I think I just got a pretty thorough reading list of things to fill me and my buddy who I'm going to be with for a month. We're going to be watching Plandemic. We're going to be watching The Social Dilemma. We're going to be watching
the
all
iconic podcast. I think his name is Jimmy Elliott, and he it's the first one of 6. He hasn't released the other ones yet, but I think that's the best one on globalism, communism.
Yeah,
iconic podcast on YouTube.
I read this book, Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand. Are you familiar with it? It's a really great book. I'm shocked there's a book I've read that you haven't read it, but are you familiar with Ayn Rand?
No, she related to...
So she's one of the, I'd say, most popular anti-communist philosophers, and she has a book called Anthem, a book called The Fountainhead, and then Atlas Shrugged is sort of her magnum opus, as they say. But she grew up in Russia during the Bolshevik years, and her family owned pharmacies, and they had them taken from them by the Bolsheviks. You know, the whole idea being that they're wealthy and therefore they're leeching off of their workers and so on. And they made it out of the country. And she saw that the same ideals from Russia were permeating the United States and the rest of the Western world. And so, you know, her mission became to sort of expose communism for the philosophy that it really is. And, you know, without spoiling the book, and she just shows this through an amazing story. I mean, it is to this day the best story I've read by a long shot. She shows this tale of these great industrialists who are building wealth and basically building jobs and building the future and building opportunity, taking responsibility for themselves and so on. at the same time, there's this parallel sort of world occurring where the governments are gaining more power. They're passing all these regulations, and she wrote this in 53, I believe it came out. But they're passing all these regulations that are strangling the industrialists, and one after one, all the industrialists start disappearing. Nobody knows what's happening to them or where they're going. But basically, the whole idea is that, people think in the communist mindset that we are meant to, our existence is supposed to be for others. She uses all these little stories and all these words and terms to expose the core of the communist philosophy. And at the end, you see that the world basically falls to hell when the creators, the mind, the ones who are really creating, are being sort of taken from, in a sense. That's the best way to simplify it that I can offer. But it's an amazing tale, and I think you would have a great time with it. That's 46 hours on Audible, though. So it's a 1,200 page book, but
wow,
it's like the length of the Bible. But it's such a good book, and I'm sure you would love it. Now, there's certain things in there where she talks about the sages of the East, and she really isn't the biggest fan of their. She's not a fan of spirituality. She's very atheist, and some describe her as a devil worshiper. And she gets a bad rap because the biggest, the guys who caused this Wall Street crash in 2008, all these large financial people and Republicans, conservatives, are huge fans of her work, and many of them, they're sort of guided by her work. And so it's not like it's the truth, capital T, but there's some really, really cool insight in there for anyone who wants to see communism. And at the same time, anyone who, I read on Quora somewhere that, someone basically said that, if you take Lord of the Rings and you take her book, one is like this fantasy that will basically corrupt people and, a young mind, and then the other is Lord of the Rings, and they're basically making fun of her book. But anyone who is communist inclined in their nature, who believes that those who are wealthy are meant to be the slaves of others, in other words, that our lives are meant to be lived exclusively to be for other people, they really don't like that book. It's like very much a trigger, but it's for a reason. Anyway.
Yeah,
so
there's a lot of young people, and that's part of what happened with our education system. Jordan Peterson warned about this years ago. Brett Weinstein, which is talked about at full length in The Madness of Crowds by Douglas Murray. But really, what anybody who's listened to Rogan's podcast has heard both those people many times speak. That's a part of the issue, is that this was infiltrated by design from CIA specialists to get radicalized students and young people and start young. Like let's get them while they're young, and let's get professors to start to teach this way. Let's get rid of gender. Let's get rid of a lot of things and start to create illusion where there hasn't been, where there has been solid science in the past. Let's make that an idea instead, right? And let's start to work around that. And he unpacks it much further than I can give right now. But the point is, it's worth investigating, because anytime you start to fuck with what we consider to be real, and we dissolve that, then we start painting with the brush of reality's whatever I want it to be, right? And this is what we can do. And then there's kids that are wearing Che Guevara shirts, and they don't understand what that leads to, right? Like, you have egalitarian societies that operated at 150 people or less. And if they grew larger than that, they would split in half or send people off to neighboring tribes to specifically keep the numbers down by design. Dunbar's number, on purpose. Right? So you could give a shit about those people. Now we live in a world with nearly 8 billion people. If you've ever been to New York, there's more people than anywhere else, and yet you feel alone because there's no connection there, right? You can't operate with that same idea. And then when you take into consideration who's in control, even if there was a chief, the chief understood he was a servant to the tribe. And any chief that was not a servant to the tribe would be fucking outed like anyone else, right? And much easier to do with 150 people. When you look at what we have now, there's all these systems in place to prevent that, right? There's all these systems in place to prevent takeovers, and yet we still see it. Good always prevails. Like, people get fucking pissed, they overthrow. The issue is that we're doomed to repeat that. And something Douglas Murray and Brett Weinstein both said is, like, in a revolution, who wins and what do you win? Well, the winner of a revolution inherits the rubble. Like, do you want to destroy everything we've created? It's much easier to destroy than it is to create. It takes a long time to create things, 9 months to create a baby, right? And all the nurturing care that goes in after that to get them to be a child and an adult. It's a lot.
You would know, yeah.
Yeah, and it can be taken that fast, right? You think of all the things that we've built that can be taken that fast. So are we in creation mode? Are we reimagining what we wish to build together right now? Or are we in fear? Do we have blinders on? Is our awareness shrunken to the point where we're only looking out for self, where it's pure survival? That's no way to live.
I agree. So I see what's happening. I had this idea a while ago where in Egypt, it was obvious that there was a pharaoh and a king, and throughout history, there's a king and a pharaoh or so on. And then there's masses who are often enslaved, so it's like that's pretty obvious. Today, it appears that the same thing is happening. It's just that the powerful have been able to do it in such a way that it's no longer so obvious. Like people don't think that we are slaves, but in many cases, it seems to me that that's exactly what's happening. So I want to ask you, with all this stuff we're talking about, someone who's listening who maybe isn't familiar with what's going on in the world, they might say, well, okay, no big deal. Let me continue in that path of your very nice voiceover of what's happening and let me just get by and survive. And I wanted to ask you, like, for those people, how would you describe what the risk really is of what's happening? Like, what is the risk of this government sort of takeover globalism? For someone who doesn't see it, what is that risk? And at the same time, for any individual living in this world today, with all the things you've learned, what is the highest ideal that you believe people can strive for to live their best life or to be of the greatest contribution?
Right. So the first, what is the risk? The risk is great because eventually we all come to understand the truth. Orwell was spot on. Brave New World, Aldous Huxley, spot on. V for Vendetta. If you haven't seen that recently, you might have watched it 10 years ago. Watch it now.
One more time, how do you say that?
V for Vendetta.
V for
also
Vendetta.
Written by the Wachowskis who did The Matrix. Fucking brilliant. Prophecy documentary disguised as a movie. Absolutely brilliant. Eventually, you can't ignore it. Eventually, you understand full well, if this does happen, how you acquiesced to allow it. One of the things V for Vendetta, V says in the movie, he takes over the single. There's only one news station at that point. Everyone's on curfew. Everyone's got to wear masks. There's a vaccine that turns people into fucking zombies. Now, of course, there's a caricature of these things, but who knows where it goes. He says, you will ask yourself, how did it get this way? Who do I point the finger at? Why is the world the way that it is now? And he said, look no further than the mirror. You all said yes in your own way. You all said yes by pretending the illusion was greater than the fact. You all said yes to wanting the toys, the car, the TV show, the whatever, instead of understanding the truth. And the stakes are as high as they possibly could be. And if you look around, like I remember when I first heard David Icke on Brian Rose at the beginning of the pandemic, he was talking about the technocracy and the totalitarian tiptoe. And, what he said was, if you want to know the future of the West, look to the East. And how in China, they already have, the reason they were putting in 5G wasn't to cause coronavirus or anything like that. It was simply so they could do faster facial recognition scans of people. And the reason for social distancing was so they could tell us apart from one another through satellite and GPS technology. And as he gets into this, I'm like, oh, that's interesting. And then all throughout the course of the pandemic, we see more 5G towers going up. And all throughout the course of that, we see cameras going up everywhere. And interestingly, I live in a brand new community here in Austin. There are cameras on the top of every streetlight. It's not a closed system that goes to our HOA. It's a system that goes to Big Brother. It has nothing to do with protecting us. It has to do with surveilling us. And I know this because something happened where there was photos taken of our home. And it turned out it was an appraiser, but it was in a black car, unmarked. And my wife saw it and she's like, this is super weird. What's going on? So I hit up the builder and I was like, hey, do you guys have access to these cameras? Because it's, some funny, person taking photos. And I called my mortgage lender and they're like, I'm sorry, the appraiser came out to look at the home, that kind of thing. And so long story short, they don't have access to the cameras. They're just going to the government. They're just going to the city. And, if you think like, well, yeah, that's conspiracy theory stuff. It's like, no. 9/11 was on purpose to implement the Patriot Act. Edward Snowden is 100% on. Like, we are being surveilled 24/7. Everyone is being watched. Everyone is being listened to. This is being listened to right now.
May I just say about Edward Snowden, have you seen that documentary that was made about him? It was really a well-done film, I would say. I don't know how exactly accurate it is, but this guy wanted to help us. Like, he wanted to show us what's happening. He was presumably a young, well-intentioned guy going into the security services to security, quote unquote, more like surveillance, but to contribute to his nation. I mean, it sounds like he was pretty intent on being of service and help to a greater vision of some kind. And he saw that what he was doing was what they're doing is not at all what he thought. And so he goes and steals data, and now he's a public enemy. I mean, the government it's like how they crucified Jesus and he was just trying to spread the truth. It's like this guy's now in asylum in Russia. Thankfully, at least he gets to be somewhere. And then Julian Assange was holed up in the Ecuadorian embassy in England for however long, 4 years. And now he's, under trial, or at least, I don't know if he's going to get a real trial. He's just probably being tortured in jail somewhere. It's just horrible how the people who, it says a lot, I guess, about how the people who most want to show us the truth are targeted and tortured, basically.
Yeah, no doubt. Well, I just point that out because of this social credit score that goes on in China, where basically how it works. And Yuri, the KGB defector, talks about this in the Iconic podcast. He's like, "Oh no, you're allowed to say whatever you want to say. Get on top of the park bench. Tell everyone this is wrong. This is what they're doing." And then the next day, your check does not come. You have no food. You have no water. And he just explains it like that. And sorry for the shitty accent, but the point is, this has already happened all over the fucking planet. And it's happening right now in some of the largest population groups we have on the planet. And so the social credit score is, if you're falling in line, if you're like one of these ass clowns on fucking mainstream media that's saying everything, you're one of the good guys. You get to fly on the private jet. You get to go to the cool party. You get to eat the nice dinner. If you're someone like me or Mickey Willis or yourself or anybody that's exposing the truth, they might come up to us one day and say like, "Oh, sorry, your social credit score just dropped and you're not allowed to live in your home anymore. You can't afford this home based on your social credit." And you're fucking out, right? Everything you have can be taken from you. There is a drive for us to not own property anymore. And people, when I first heard that, I was like, that's absurd. There's no one I know that's not going to want to own their car, own their this, or own their that. But there's plenty of people who live in big cities and they're like, "Oh no, I just rather Uber. I don't need to own a car. I just rather rent an apartment. I don't need to own a house." It's like there's something to ownership. There's something to having something that's yours because access can be taken from you. And that's already the plan with a quantum tattoo. Get all these shots, turn your health over to us, or you're not allowed to fly, and you're not allowed to go into Whole Foods, and you're not allowed to go to school, and you're not allowed to go to the movies, and you're not allowed to fill in the blank. That's what this looks like. And it's going to happen over the next 10 years. It's not going to happen overnight. But these are the incremental steps that are being taken as a totalitarian tiptoe that are happening, that have already started. This isn't 10 years from now. That was my realization. I was like walking through the neighborhood when I realized this wasn't a closed loop security system. I was like, "Oh, this shit's right now. It's right now. It's right now." And then the biggest pill to swallow, the hardest pill to swallow was like, David Icke is at least 90% correct. He's not off on everything. He might be off on a couple things, but he's not off on everything. And same with what's his name down the street? Our boy, you mentioned him on Rogan's. Alex Jones. He's right about 90%. When he starts getting off into Luciferian worship and all this shit and ranting and raving and he sounds like a pro wrestler, he loses me there. But if I was just to read a transcript of the things that he's saying, it's like if I can take Ric Flair's voice out of it, he's saying a lot of truth. And that shit no one wants to look at, right? There's the cognitive dissonance. That's where we go, no, that's too much. I just want to go about my business and do my thing. To answer the second part of your question, there's the illusion of self as a separate entity. from the rest of all that is. That's a big illusion. That's ego, right? Both of these are intertwined, by the way. So we have an ego on purpose, and we have a high self, a soul, or a super conscious part of the self that is greater than that. That too is by design. If they're both meant to be there, they both serve a purpose. How we integrate those two halves, masculine and feminine, within ourselves, ego and superconscious soul consciousness, into unity consciousness, is the understanding that they are both necessary. It's not the finger point and look outside ourselves and project an evil in one or the other. Communism takes an idea of it working for a greater good that stands outside myself. I will sacrifice myself. I will be the martyr that serves the whole at the expense of self. That's not right. The inverse of that is wrong as well, where I only serve self at the expense of other. If I integrate them both, I understand I can serve the all, which is inclusive of self, right? Something we talk about in Fit for Service, Aubrey Marcus's mastermind that I'm one of the coaches in, is the fit for portion is your own training. That's the dojo. That's Neo in the Matrix, downloading Kung Fu and then training with Morpheus, right? This is where I put myself to task to be the strongest, most endured, and I don't mean this just in a physical sense, but true inner strength, true inner endurance, a true moral compass to know how to serve. I can exercise that through many of the different teachings that have gone on, from physical, mental, emotional to spiritual, and many of the different practices, from how I quiet my mind, how I integrate nature on a daily basis, like brushing my teeth or taking a shower, how I may put myself to task through different plant medicine ceremonies where I'm not going to be in control. I got to buckle up and sit back and just experience the experience and then integrate that well so I don't fracture the psyche. All of these tools can be used, but that is the fit for portion of that. If I wish to serve, I can only serve as much medicine as I contain within myself. And the goal is not to serve on a half cup. That's depleting. I need to fill my cup first. And Robert Kiyosaki talked about that in Rich Dad, Poor Dad. Pay yourself first before you pay the IRS, before you pay your electric bill, before you pay anyone. Pay yourself first, then pay all the other things. And you might argue with that and be like, yeah, but then you go to jail or you got no electricity or any of these other things. Pay yourself first, used in a spiritual sense or in the service sense, is to make sure your cup is full. Every drawing, most drawings of Archangel Michael, there is a chalice in his left hand that's empty, that he holds up to the light, to be filled with the light. And in the right hand is the sword of truth and discernment. And he fills that cup first by receiving from the feminine before he acts to carve through illusion and reveal the truth with the sword. It's not to cut down or kill, it's to simply reveal what needs to be revealed. And it is boundaries. It is the warrior archetype, right? But you must fill that cup first. We have to fill our cup first. To be of service to the all, that is inclusive of ourselves. That means we have to fill our cup first. That means if I'm not right, I need to get myself in order first. If I'm in a state of panic, frenzy, and even though I get hyped when I'm talking about this, and I certainly went through my own fucking dark night of the soul.
I'd like to talk about that.
This remembering that when I feel comfortable, when I operate without pain, and I mean that on every sense of the scale, if my body's in pain, I'm going to have a short fuse with my son. Like if he jumps on my neck and I haven't stretched and done yoga and I fucking feel old kinks and pains from jujitsu and breaking my neck, what comes out of me right then in that moment isn't going to be compassion. It's not going to be, oh, hey, buddy, daddy's neck's a little hurt right now. Can you go gentler? Can you soften up? He's 5 years old. He's got one speed, right? So how can I prepare myself through opening the body, through breathing into it, through relaxing, through doing the right exercises to be strong and able to withstand, right? Like I got to do that just to meet him as a dad. That's a personal, very personal explanation of one facet of life, but that's an important facet of life, how I show up as a father to my son, right? So fill my cup first in all areas on a daily basis and make it the most important thing I do so that when I go to serve others, it's from the overflowing wellspring of my chalice. It's not from a place of depletion, because anyone who's a martyr, and we see this with fat nurses who, they just want to help everyone else, but they don't take care of themselves. The Westminster Dog Show. Anybody who's seen Best in Show, hilarious movie, mockumentary. A lot of people who have these super high-end dogs, they feed them only the best food. They eat like dog shit themselves. They don't take care of themselves because they will only look outward and project the best within this
Like
creation.
the health ministers in a lot of different places. You've probably seen the memes online, but the heads of health, the heads of the health department of all these different countries are morbidly obese a lot of the time.
Yeah,
It's
well,
like,
they
these
don't
are the
know health
people-
themselves, so they certainly can't
Yeah.
be one to speak to. That's why a person like Paul Chek resonates so much, because the guy's 59 years old and he's stronger than I am. And he
something.
looks the fucking part and walks the walk, right? It's undeniable. If somebody's getting Rob Wolf too, but if somebody's trying to tell me like, this is the key, this is the way you need to eat, this is what your genetics tell me, and all these different things, and they themselves are not healthy, no, sorry, dude. It doesn't work that way, right? And if we're the living embodiment of everything we're speaking about, that's what resonates with people. Because there is an element of, I can speak this from the heart and it'll resonate, but show me still, right? I need to see it in you if I'm going to really buy into that. I need to see, if I'm going to talk about family and relationship and these things, like, you damn well better have a working marriage. You damn well better have a working family. You damn well better have tools that not only affected you, but affected others, and then a way to take people back to that, right? Like, tell me where you learned this. Like, there's so much information now. Very few times do we see somebody that's innovated something directly from self, and you could argue that comes from the collective anyways, like tapping into the collective consciousness, whatever that is. Point being, it helps a lot when there are ways to expand upon the things we speak about, right? Here's a documentary, here's a book, here's a person I learned it from. They do this type of coaching. This will help you out. The more areas of expertise we can deliver to people, and if the spark is there for them to want to dive in, then that flowers consciousness. Then they dive in and solve mysteries. It may be physical, it may be emotional, it may be any of these other things, it may be mental, but we start to fine tune and know thyself, which is the whole name of the game. And from there, we can operate at a frequency that's much higher. When we recognize darkness within ourselves and choose the light and illuminate consciousness where there is unconsciousness, that's when we step into our being and can change the world from the inside out. So the highest form of service, I would say, is not one or the other. It's not focusing on self, which is ego, or what Paul Levy says. What is it? It's he has a term for it. It's something egophrenia. I'm forgetting the M word that he made up to make a westernized version of Wetiko, which is the Native American word for darkness. But it shortens it, abbreviates it to ME. It's me, my, mine, right? It's kid psychology, which is what we see in the shadow form of masculinity. It's what we see in the shadow form of our leaders. Kid psychology, me, my, mine. That's not right. The martyr on the other side that projects all giving to the all, but not to self, not considering self as a part of the all. That doesn't work either. So when we understand our interconnectivity to all things and our interdependence upon all things, that's what Native Americans described as the sacred hoop. It is our belonging to that. It is the fact that nature isn't a word in many Native cultures because that identifies something separate from self, right? We're in nature right now in my living room. We are indistinguishable from nature, from God. We are all of it. All is of or nothing is, as Paul Selig states. When we come to that understanding, it's easy to jump from, okay, I'm going to not be in the self-service and just be in the all-service, but to negate self in doing so, communism, right? We have to marry those two. That's alchemy. And we have to form that sacred union within from the masculine and the feminine. Hope that kind of touches on.
I would say it really does.
Okay.
I think of this morning, I was reading the Dr. Bronner soap bottle in my shower.
It's so
Have
good.
you read it? Yeah.
Yeah, I always
and they
read
go
those.
through just truth after truth after truth after truth, the all one or none religion, as they call it.
Yeah.
It's very nice. Anyone who's listening to this who doesn't quite get it, just read your Dr. Bronner soap bottle in your bathroom and you'll have
meditate on the full-length version of as above, so below, as within, so without. And so there's much more to that. But punch that into DuckDuckGo, fuck Google, or SwissCows.net. It's a really good one as well. Get a Brave browser. All these recommendations are in the Czech podcast with Joe Mercola, who's brilliant and a guy we've been following for a long time. But you punch that in and just get that full length and just sit with that, as above, so below, as within, so without, and come to that understanding. Like we are one. And that can be scary at times for a certain part of self, the misidentification with self, ego self.
One of the things that came up while you were talking is I was thinking about the surveillance state and the new iPhones and how the even before a quantum tattoo and so on, the iPhones and the phones are sort of like already bound to us. They're not necessarily internal, but for many we're already addicted to them. But I was just thinking I was about to go buy the iPhone 12 and I'm like, maybe I should just stick with my 10 in case there's some extra layer of surveillance that they'll have on me when I'm in Costa Rica.
Yeah, and the automatic updates that do the contact tracing, shit like that, So like you may be in contact with other people with COVID-19. I may be in contact with somebody else who has a fucking common cold. Big deal. Who cares? You know what I'm saying? Like at the end of the day, like if people die all the time, should we protect the elderly and people who have comorbidities? Yes, no doubt. But that doesn't mean we should shut down the economy and cause the side effect of increased suicide, increased alcohol, increased domestic violence, and the pillaging of the middle class. Bezos isn't getting hurt. He's made 450 plus billion since March in less than a year. Because everybody's got to order through Amazon. Think of this, like it's plain as night and day if you look at it. But again, don't take my word for it. Check out some of the stuff we've listed.
Yeah, I think what's so almost hard to grasp, even for me, and we're sitting here talking about this, and I've learned about all these things, but for people who aren't exposed, even harder to grasp, maybe. But this idea that Nazi Germany, we think of it as something in the distant past that could never happen again. And same with communist Russia and current communist China and many other places, Venezuela, where pretty nasty, brutal things are occurring. And we think that couldn't happen in the United States of America. That would never happen in the United States of America. And yet I think that from what I'm understanding of this conversation is that's sort of where this very well could go, where it is a sort of surveillance state where people are not just not able to get their house if they don't follow the rules, but people could be basically being tortured and put in concentration camps essentially. And again, people hear that maybe and say, oh, that's not possible. That's not going to happen. But what's to keep it from happening? I mean, everything is trending in that direction based on what's occurring right now. And I was reading this book that Ben Greenfield loaned me, which is Speeches That Change the World. I love being at his house because he has this massive library, and I get to grab a book or two every time I go and chat with him, and he'll hand me something he thinks is of particular relevance. And I just was drawn to this book, Greatest Speeches of All History. Short book, but great chunks of history from the 10 Commandments to Muhammad to the Sermon on the Mount, all the way up to inauguration addresses of presidents. And one that stuck with me most profoundly in regards to this discussion especially is Stalin gave a speech in the beginning of World War II, and it wasn't released until 1991, but he basically said the war must go on as long as possible. In other words, when the war began, World War II, Russia wasn't strong enough to really fight. And in the speech, he basically says, we need the Western Front to be as weak as possible. We need the Germans to fight until they're done. We need the Westerners to fight till everything they have is exhausted. And then we'll be able to spread the Red Army across the globe, and communism will be able to conquer the whole planet. Like, this was, terrifying, like beyond terrifying, reading this speech, thinking like Stalin knew exactly what he was after. It wasn't just, strengthening Russia and expanding Russia. It was like, we want this. For me, it's beyond terrifying, the idea, but terrifying is maybe not the best word. It is, though. It really thinking about what communism really is. And he wanted that to perpetuate across the entire globe. And in many ways, it's successful that it's going so far. So I'd really like to ask you, you mentioned, of course, you've had your dark night of the soul and probably in many different ways. I look at you as like a Renaissance man of today, and people like you, I feel particularly inspired just being around you, Paul Chek. I haven't met Aubrey except briefly when we did that interview, but just listening to him and hearing his work, and Ben Greenfield as well. And I think of you guys as these modern Renaissance men who I really look up to, people who are psychonauts, as you use the term. It's a bit more of a modern term maybe to describe it, but I think that there's really something strikes a chord about this pursuit of truth and pursuit of self-improvement and pursuit of research and learning all the time. So I'd really love to hear a bit about, your journey from working at titty bars and doing, the things you were doing as you were a younger guy, and then, being a UFC fighter, and how did you come to sort of become this modern Renaissance man who's really, I would say, you're guiding a lot of people to capital T truth, and you're not sitting here saying, I am the guru, follow me, I am the wise one. You're just shining that flashlight. But how did you get to that point? I mean, that's got to be, it's probably a really long conversation, but in your words, what have been the most pivotal steps and the things that brought you there? And what was that, I'm assuming there's been a spark all along there where when you were here, you sort of always had this knowing that there is something beyond. Like Dr. Joe will talk about how we don't really need to learn anything. We just have to remember. And he says in his meditation, he says, remember.
Space.
Yeah.
Space.
I just sat there for a week.
Perennium.
I'm sitting here actually as we're talking, just observing my mind wandering in every which way possible direction it could always go. I'm like, 1, 4, 6, 1, 4, 6, perineum, heart, pineal gland, just tuning in. But anyhow, what was that? How's that journey, been for you?
The Cliff Notes is, and to, Joe's idea that it was always there. There always was a spark in me from a young age, and always a knowing of something is clearly off. The thing that was off for me was the amount my parents fought, and everybody's had their own personal traumas and things like that, but it was the opposite of nonviolent communication, like two rams butting heads, and it was really tough for me, but that lit a fire in me and also wanted me to express that fire on others. I loved fighting when I was young and played football, got into fighting. And when I got into mixed martial arts, I had a boxing coach who had Mayan descent, would take me to the Native American reservation for traditional sweat lodges as well as plant medicine ceremonies. And that really opened me up.
As a teenager?
No, this happened, after football in my 20s. We started working together. It took probably 2 years in MMA. I probably started working with him when I was 26, I want to say. And so somewhere between 26 and 30, started to dive deeper with him. And, that really opened me up. It showed me viscerally as a known experience. They talk about that. It moves beyond rational thinking or thought confirmation where you're like, I do this little experiment and I'm like, oh, okay, that validates it. It's like, no. Like it is instantly known, instantly remembered, like what the nature of consciousness is, the interconnectivity of all things, and shown visually with eyes open or shut, various ways that is verified. So that's in a nutshell, one of the greatest teachings that plant medicines gave me was a return to that knowledge. And fighting gave to me a couple of things. One, the warrior's mentality of really taking my body seriously, knowing that every inch of recovery I could get was important. And that lit a fire under me to learn more. That's something that was kind of extinguished in college at ASU. Was like, I don't give it. I care about a handful of classes. And if it resonated, I'd get an A. And if it didn't, it was just a course I had to take. I couldn't fucking stand it. It was just like, why do I have to learn this shit? It was no different than high school. But fighting was like, oh, I get to learn stuff that actually matters to me. Like if I study Kelly Starrett, I'm going to learn how to increase mobility. If I study Wim Hof, I'm going to learn breath work and mind mastery and the power of the cold. And all of these different avenues, fighting was the impetus for that, for me to understand the body better. And the body truly is our tuning fork. It affects everything from our mental, emotional states to how I think, feel, and operate during the day. And everybody's wondering about, cognitive improvements from nootropics and the right balance of caffeine and modafinil and sleep mastery and all this shit. And it's like, you master the body, and look, sleep's a part of that. Nootropics and caffeine can be a part of that. But when you master the body, you begin to master all systems, right? And that's what Czech teaches, is that the whole thing is holistic. You don't have a liver issue. You might have a liver issue that has come from several other reasons, and it could be mental, emotional even, that unprocessed anger and all sorts of shit that we learn in teachings of the East. But the bottom line is that you look at this thing as a whole, you begin to uncover so much more in the way all these systems bleed into one another. So fighting taught me about the body. It also gave me the impetus to learn more. And then when fighting ended, did have a fair amount of knocks to the noggin, and I really wanted to improve cognitive function. I wanted to heal the brain, and that's when I got into the ketogenic diet, fasting. Further research was coming out on the power of psychedelics and healing the hardware, the physical structure of the brain, not just the software, mental, emotional structure of the brain. And that all just bled into more. Like, it's like the momentum behind that was hard to push pause on. And that led me to Onnit and podcasting. I jumped on Rogan's, got me into podcasting. And then podcasting, as you know, is the wellspring. It's like, oh shit, I get to interview experts in any given field and have conversations that are filling me first.
At
right?
what point did you meet like Aubrey and Paul? Where did that kind of fall into your journey? And
I met Aubrey. So I was actually in an ayahuasca ceremony, and I was debating on going to Paleo FX for the first time. I couldn't really afford it. And Aya was telling me definitively, you're going to go. And I would argue, like, I don't have the money. And it's like, you'll have the money. And I've already read every fucking book from all these guys, like Rob Wolf, Marxist, and what am I going to learn with them speaking for 20 minutes on stage? And it's like, you're not going to learn, you're going to meet people. So sure enough, I say yes. And, plane tickets get cut in half. Mind Pump hits me up. They're like, you're going to have, you can stay with us. You can do it on the couch at all these Airbnbs. So I'm with them the whole time. My cost of the trip cut significantly. And I meet Aubrey there. He's one of the people I wanted to meet.
Where were you living at the time?
I was in Vegas with my wife for about 4 months. Left the Bay Area, and we didn't think of Vegas as like a permanent home, but much, much cheaper, no state income tax, that kind of shit. Also different vaccine laws, having a son. Those were all important to us. We knew we weren't going to stay in California long with everything that was transpiring around that. And Tasha was born and raised there, so we had family, which is important when you got kids. But I go on this trip, meet Aubrey, meet a ton of great people, and then Aubrey and I share the same flight back to Vegas, which is where they were looking at opening their second Onnit gym. And we just trade war stories around everything I've learned around fighting, warrior archetype, fasting, cognitive improvement, healing the brain, all this shit. And he's like, dude, I need you to come work for me at Onnit. And I was like, I don't know, man. He's like, well, let's go to Burning Man. I'll bring you and your wife to Burning Man, and we can see what's up from there. And we hit it off. He's my best friend and my absolute soul brother. And neither of us work for Onnit anymore. He's still on the board. But when he stepped down as CEO, it was a corporate job without my best friend working there. So I stepped down as well, and we still work together in Fit for Service. That's been an excellent way to get hands-on with people. We have about 150 members. That's really a hands-on focus. But, the trajectory has been the light inside, the understanding something's not right in the world, and it wasn't right in my very close proximity of home. And it wasn't right in every level of school. I can count on one hand how many teachers took me under their wing and gave a shit that I'd pass. And always was intelligent, always had the raw materials to learn, So now in fighting, given this ability to choose, to learn whatever I want and access, from the internet and from all the books that are available, and Audible, which is owned by Amazon, obviously, but just access to this information, I was able to chew and digest and process and implement being the most important piece. Something Paul Chek told me was, somebody who reads a lot of books but doesn't implement or integrate any of them is just the smartest guy in the room who doesn't know what the fuck he's talking about, right? Like it's the equivalent of somebody who goes to every ayahuasca event, but you don't see much change in their life, right? They have all these ceremonies. They're always talking about the ceremonies and the visions they've had, but you don't see much change in their life. There's more people than there should be around that, right? Integration and how we hone that and ground it back to 3D is absolutely critical. Otherwise, it's just an old cool trip or an old cool vision, or it's like hearing somebody tell you about a dream they had that was awesome. Okay, and what? right? Like the dream may be fantastic. How did it change your life is more important than anything, right? And I could give hundreds of examples of ways that this has helped me fine tune to be a better father, to be a better husband, to be better to me, to treat myself better. You know, that was a big one. That was one of the first big lessons, treating myself better, to not lean on alcohol and cannabis as a crutch, but to know like I can choose even without a fight coming up. You know, I've retired from fighting in 2014, that there still is something driving me towards improvement, towards knowing myself more, to honing myself, that there is no mountaintop that you reach. Self-mastery is ongoing and ever unfolding, as consciousness itself is infinitely unfolding.
You just get a better and better view as you go up the never-ending mountain.
Correct,
right?
man. And I want to send you a link. You know, this has been one of the issues I had with David Icke's podcast on London Real, the first one. He's done 5 since quarantine started, or since the pandemic started. But it was 90% negative, and the last 10% he explained consciousness better than anyone I've ever heard. And I was like, why couldn't he have led with that? So many people I shared this podcast with were like, I don't want to fucking hear it. You know, it was like too much for him. And perhaps this has been too much for a lot of the listeners here. But, you know, if he had reversed that in some ways, and hopefully I've done a decent job of trickling back and forth, you know, ways to improve ourselves, which in turn allows us to improve the whole. There was an excellent video that I saw from 4 years ago with Daniel Schmachtenberger that I plan on rewatching on a weekly basis on emergence. And it is fucking brilliant, dude. It is so brilliant because it's speaking to what consciousness is becoming.
Schmachtenberger. What's the name of this?
I'm just gonna, let me pull it up here.
I'm sure
I'll have you link to it.
With my minor German knowledge, I bet I could smell Schmachtenberger, spell Schmachtenberger.
What I want to talk about today is what emergence is.
So good. Alrighty. It's called Daniel Schmachtenberger's Talk at Emergence. SCHMACHTENBERGER.
I'll brag that I spelled it right on my notepad. It's just basic German.
You know, and he's got so much good stuff. He really does. One of the things he's talked about is one of the ways we bridge the gap in his War on Sense-Making podcast from the left and right, the divide that we see, because it's inherent. Like things are getting further and further apart. They're not coming together yet. Is that we need to learn, as Renaissance men did in Greece, to know every argument inside and out, to steel man the opposition's argument, not straw man it. You don't set it up like, oh yeah, you know, this guy's a Trump supporter and he's a fucking racist. Fuck that guy too. What does he like about Trump, right? Or this guy likes Biden and Biden's fucking, you know, in bed with the CCP and all these, whatever the thing is, like, don't straw man it. Understand it fully. Understand it better than they understand it. So at the bare minimum, you come to appreciate why they know what they know and believe what they believe. And from there, backtrack your way to find your new truth, which was what you knew before you knew their argument inside and out, right? That brings us together. And at the bare minimum, it allows us to come to a place of communication that has better understanding, where we don't just scoff and disregard and cancel culture someone else's thought process. We know it better because we know it for ourselves. Right? He has, and that's Cliff Notes at best. He really explains this in much greater detail. But this one from 4 years, it's only 25 minutes. It's not, and I encourage people, if you've made it this far, of everything I've given you, this might be the most important. It's a 25-minute video. It might be the most important.
Daniel Schmachtenberger on emergence.
Yeah, and the link will be in the show notes. I just sent it to you, Matt. Because it does speak to what's happening in the world. It speaks to the absolute sense of we're at a juncture where if we do it right, we can create something that's never been done before. We can come into unity consciousness. We can become integrated with the whole in a way where we recognize ourselves for what we are. We're cells in the grand body, right? Are we a cancer or do we work in harmony?
Yeah, like
right?
Joe says, are you contributing to the energy of the room and the events, or are you taking from it?
Yeah. And so if we come into that, we can create something that's never been created here before. We truly can come into the 5th stage of consciousness, right? Whether that's 5D, Christ consciousness, Buddha consciousness, whatever, they're all parallels for saying the same thing. Do we evolve right now? Or does this whole thing fucking collapse? That's the timeline we're in right now. And it's up to us right now to decide that. Schmachtenberger really points this out in such a beautifully well said, well thought, articulate way, and well studied. I mean, him alongside Jamie Wheel, they're people who are brilliant minds academically, who have thought through and spoken with many of the greatest minds on the planet to develop real ideas around what we are becoming and how high the stakes are right now. So like it's not just the sky is falling, look at all the shit. It's like, no, okay, that may be true, but we have the opportunity here for something different, and this is a way that we can step into our being to make this whole thing change.
At Dr. Joe's event, and for those listening, I realize I didn't say it on the podcast, but I was just at a week-long advanced meditation workshop with Dr. Joe Dispenza, who's a thought leader. He's been on the Aubrey Marcus podcast and so on, in the field of meditation and using your mind to change your matter and really
manifestation.
Connecting to the higher consciousness, whatever name we'd like to give it, source, singularity, infinite, so on. So I was there, and we do these sitting, he would do a teaching or a lecture and then meditation and so on, and sets a model. He builds up a model for even those most skeptical, to be open to the mystical, open to their energy centers, open to connecting to oneness and having mystical experiences and so on. And so we would do walking meditations as well on the beach, and it's really amazing to see 1,000 people walking on a beach. It's almost like the people who are at the hotel who aren't part of the event are filming like what's going on. And he and his team are very targeted on which some of the weeks, it seems, that they've done their events are the same weeks that there's big things happening politically and so on, so that there's maybe a little bit less attention. They have to be careful, they have to comply with the hotel and everything, but they're able to pull off these events where in a time where it's just very hard. Tony Robbins, all his events are canceled, and so they're doing amazing things. Anyway, I was walking on the beach, and you have him in your ears. Everyone downloads the app, and you have the meditations, and he's just talking about how you have to want it. You have to get big. You have to step into the mind of the mystic, of the healer, of your future. And I was walking at one moment and just feeling this sort of closedness I felt in my heart and in my energy centers in my body and my mind for a while, which I think many people feel all the time, this sort of closeness. And I said, what's between me right now and feeling in love with life? Where's that blockage? And I kind of told myself, by the time I get to the end of they had people kind of standing, his volunteers kind of guarding perimeters so people wouldn't walk into the ocean or it's too far down the beach. And I said, by the time I walk the length of this couple hundred meters, I'm going to be a different person. I'm going to choose to be that and let go of whatever's limiting me in this moment. And I just, with that intention, I just automatically felt this connection to everyone around. I was like, oh my gosh, like 1,000 people walking on the beach right now. Like, I love these people. Like, I feel their energy. And that just somehow opened me up. Like, why am I denying myself this? Why was I denying myself this sense of connection and feeling those around? And of course, that brought up all sorts of positive emotions because my heart was starting to open a bit more and the energy could, flow the way it's designed to. But I just couldn't help but think about that when you're talking about this idea of oneness and people just realizing that we are part of a greater whole, that, that was my experience with it. We're not just these isolated units of existence, but we are part of a much greater whole. And so I think, however it happens for you, listener, there's a lot more to connect to. And they talk about it at his events, how like the love is almost too much in some, not too much, but people will start having these mystical experiences in their brainwaves. He shows brain scans the whole event long in each lecture of people going from regular beta, which is where we exist mostly, down to alpha, down to theta, down to deep theta, but without falling into delta, sleeping. And then when someone's in deep theta enough, they're either an experienced meditator or they're just open, they hop up into high beta, but that's not like a stress state. It's just the transition into gamma. And they show the brain scan becomes so high, like whereas the waves are just kind of chill waves. Even in beta, they're a little less coherent, and then alpha's more coherent, and theta's bigger waves, more coherent, and so on. When you go into high beta, it's coherent, but more energy. And then when you go into gamma, it's like someone took crayons and just kind of scratched them up and down, but they're all perfectly aligned, all the brain waves. And people will say, many people at the event, they use the verb to pop. It's like he popped or she popped or, oh, he's about to pop. And people will literally start shaking, screaming. I mean, they're getting it downloaded, and afterwards they'll just say like, oh my gosh, like it was almost too much. I met a guy there who, like you talk about how Aubrey's your soul brother. I met someone who I feel is sort of my soul brother. He's a 21-year-old, and Joe brought him on the stage because he had popped at the event. He had some massive openings, but he had been like many people of my generation, depressed and struggling. And then on top of that, he was at Marjorie Stoneman Douglas in Florida, which is a high school where there's 17 kids who were killed in a shooting and many more injured. And a friend of his committed suicide because of the grief of losing her best friend that she couldn't get over. And he just decided he wasn't going to go that direction. He learned about Dr. Joe and went really deep onto his work the last year. And so he already had some deep experiences in his meditation, completely overcame his depression. And he was actually throughout the event, like he would not do some of the meditations and not do some of the breath work because he's like, I can't handle this. Because he was so open that he would drop right into that gamma state. And once you're in, you really can't get out. You just be shaking and just overflowed with love. But it's amazing what's out there. So to sort of wrap up, I'd really like to ask you for both myself and for any young gentleman or woman, the divine masculine, the divine feminine, people who have that spark, who know that there's this greater awareness out there. From your experiences and your journey alongside the truth and towards the truth, where would you direct people to start? Whether it's, I know you've given a bajillion book suggestions and things to do, but mentally, how do you suggest people approach this journey to reaching and realizing their own truth and reconnecting with this awareness so that we're not falling prey to being the person who's on the assembly line building a tank, but actually we're taking ownership and doing our best as an individual, both in the becoming fit and serving?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, looking at things holistically and understanding that the world is unhealthy, even if we have the appearance of health, I think The Last 4 Doctors You'll Ever Need is an ebook by Paul Chek. Absolutely brilliant. He goes through Dr. Movement, your movement practice, Dr. Quiet, sleep, meditation, Dr. Diet, what goes into your body, and then Dr. Happiness. Like, is the dream big enough? And really talks about that. You can have any one of these things right, and if one's off, it's going to hurt the whole system. So I think that's part of the filling the cup idea before we serve. There's so many great books on spirituality. I mean, it's like pick one. A New Earth was one of the most important books I've ever read from Eckhart Tolle. And it's funny because, he got big on the scene from The Power of Now, and Schmachtenberger brings it up in this 25-minute video. He's like, there's all these spiritual teachers saying, just be here now, be in the now. And, Ram Dass is phenomenal too. He has an audible, what's the hell? It might be Here Now. I gotta think of it as
the one really good book I know is Be Here Now, but I don't know if that's the audible version. Right?
It's give me a second here. The Alchemist by Paulo Coelho, Coelho. Brilliant.
I remember listening to that book, and I was landscaping after the summer after I graduated high school, and I just was in complete tears. Like, it was so beautiful trying to push the lawnmower. I was like, oh my God, this is so beautiful.
Becoming Nobody by Ram Dass. It's only on Audible. It's a series of his lectures in his 50s. Okay. Absolutely changed my life. The Lion Trekker's Guide to Life. It's only 3 hours long, by Boyd Varty, Boyd Varty. He's been on the podcast. He's a lion trekker out of South Africa who runs the Landalusi Game Reserve. Brilliant dude. So yeah, 3 hours is a Rogan podcast. Those are a handful of some of my all-time favorites. But what I was getting to with Eckhart Tolle and the Be Here Now and the Power of Now and all these teachings is like, well, look, kids and animals, they're so present. They're so present. You can see the joy in them. We should be emulating that. And the thing where Schmachtenberger turns it on its head is it's like, yeah, but we have this gift of past, present, and future. We've only been using it incorrectly. We've only been using it to think of the past thing that occurred, the trauma, and not want to repeat it, living in fear. We've only been using the future to think of the upcoming event we don't want to have happen.
Like Dr. Joe talks about how when you live in the emotions of the past, you're going to live in the same predictable future because those emotions are always creating the same thing. So you meditate every day to create that new future and to live with the vision of the future.
Yeah. And so Dispenza's doing the exact same thing Schmachtenberger's talking about. We imagine with the power of imagination the future we want, and then we pull ourselves towards that. We don't use pain to poke us in the rear end and push us forward. We use the beauty of the light at the end of the tunnel to pull ourselves and draw ourselves to the future we create.
May I add, Dr. Joe adds that he said, and this is a hard thing for me to understand quantum-wise, just because I'm trying to rationalize and all this stuff, but he says you're not even pulling yourself towards it in the quantum field. You're really just pulling it towards you, and it's funny that we're not filming this, but Kyle was kind of pulling on a rope, imagining pulling on a rope. But it's funny that you did that, because as I saw that, is there any difference in the quantum field between you pulling yourself towards it on that rope or you pulling it towards you in the quantum field?
Yeah. Or it pulling you in as you draw your focus, like maybe that future pulls me to it. Whatever the case is, right? It is the proper way of using our gift, and it's a gift, and everything in the paradox of what God is, right? That's what Paul Chek told me. He's like, at the top of the heap, God is paradox, because anything you say of it, the opposite is true, right? All is over nothing means that at the end of the day, it's everything. So how do I want to live? My free will dictates that. And if I can utilize this future as the future of my dreams and pull myself towards that with action and with the way of being and feeling, right? That's where Dispenza is brilliant. It's not just think it. It's not write it down or put a fucking, a collage on the wall and say like, that's going to happen. It's only going to happen if I feel into that each day. It's only going to happen if the power of those emotions are in resonance with the future I wish to create. And even if that's all bullshit, which I don't think it is, hindsight is foresight. I can look in the past and see everything that I've accomplished in life I called in. And I did it with feeling and action, right? It wasn't a wish that I made. It was through feeling into that experience and believing it as it is so, praying as if it is already here, right? So when we begin to do that, even if that was bullshit, I'm going to live in love up until I meet that. I'm going to live in love. I'm going to live in joy. I'm going to live at my best. I'm going to be the best dad. I'm going to be the best husband. I'm going to be the best everything I can be, because my resonance is such that the cup is overflowing. If I spend every day of my life until I die and I go, oh, that shit was all make-believe. Sorry. They didn't know. Well, I fucking lived it. I lived the dream. I lived to the best of my abilities every day, right? And it didn't mean there was, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Of course that happens. But pick yourself up, bring yourself back into resonance, and be that spark, be the love.
I just recall the podcast Aubrey did with Sadhguru recently, and how he said that, just like you're saying, it's the misuse of he said that the mind is sort of like a knife, where if you grabbed the blade and called it the handle, you're just misusing it. It's not that the knife is flawed. And in the same way, he says, between sort of in the back of our brain, so to speak, there's the memory bank, and then there's the intellect, or I should say identification, in between memory and the intellect. And if we're identifying incorrectly, then that's when we're going to suffer, because the memories are just one thing that's a record, and the intellect is something we can use. But if we're identifying as this limited individual self as opposed to the greater whole, then we will suffer. And it was particularly fitting for me in this case, because one of the other blue blocking companies has actually sponsored that very podcast, and I observed myself like a real trigger, like, oh gosh, but then I listened to Sadhguru for an hour, I'm like, oh, I'm just limited identification, it's all good.
Well, I'm rocking raw optics every night, brother.
Thanks, man.
I got them on. My wife's got them on.
We'll talk.
We love them, dude. Yeah,
appreciate
absolutely.
it, man. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Kyle, for all of your wisdom and all the work you're doing. Like I said, you're a true inspiration to me. So
yeah, brother.
So
I love you,
grateful to
Matt.
be able to speak to you.
Absolute
I love
pleasure,
you too,
dude.
Kyle.
Absolute
Thank you.
pleasure.